Mafia boss came home during a storm, and found his maid holding his crying baby. Why was the maid holding his crying baby during the storm? What would the Mafia boss discover after returning home unexpectedly? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to SevenTev Stories, where unexpected homecomings and emotional discoveries can change relationships forever. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss one of our newest stories. Thank you for every view, comment, share, and moment you spend with us. Your continued support helps SevenTev Stories reach more viewers and build a stronger community. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there right now. We always love hearing from people watching across the globe. Now, settle in, listen carefully, and let us enter the opening scene of today's unforgettable story. He thought the storm was the most dangerous thing waiting for him at home, until he opened his own front door and saw the one person in the mansion who was never supposed to touch his child. Alexander Moretti stepped into the marble foyer at 2:13 in the morning, rainwater sliding from the shoulders of his black overcoat and dripping onto a floor polished bright enough to reflect the lightning outside. The storm had followed him across Chicago like a warning, bending trees along the private drive, rattling the iron gates, shaking the windows of the Moretti estate as if the whole house had been holding its breath. Behind him, Luca Romano closed the door against the wind, and for one brief second, the mansion returned to its usual silence, that expensive, disciplined silence Alexander had paid good money to maintain. Then he heard it. Not thunder. Not glass. A baby's broken sob, thin and exhausted, coming from the grand staircase. Alexander's body went still. For 8 months, Ethan Moretti had been the only soft thing left in his world, the only name that could make armed men lower their voices and hardened servants walk on careful feet. No one entered the nursery without permission. No one picked him up without instruction. No one carried him beyond the 3rd floor. Those rules had been written after his wife's funeral, when grief had turned Alexander's home into a fortress and his love into something guarded, sharp, and afraid. But halfway down the staircase, beneath the chandelier flickering with every pulse of lightning, stood Naomi Brooks. The new maid. 29 years old. Quiet. Black. Invisible by habit, or so everyone had thought. Her gray uniform was damp at the sleeves. Her natural curls had loosened from their neat bun. One cheek shone with rainwater, or tears, Alexander could not tell. In her arms, wrapped in a white blanket too large for his tiny body, Ethan trembled and cried against her shoulder, his little fist gripping the collar of her dress like she was the only solid thing left in the storm. For a moment, nobody moved. Mrs. Whitaker appeared at the upper landing, pale as the wall behind her. One of the younger guards reached for his radio. Luca's eyes shifted from Naomi to Alexander, waiting for a command. The air changed. It grew colder than the rain outside. Alexander looked at his son, then at the maid holding him, and something in his face closed like a door being locked. Naomi saw it happen. She saw the suspicion, the authority, the kind of controlled anger that did not need shouting to fill a room. Her hands tightened protectively around the baby before she could stop herself. Ethan whimpered harder, burying his face against her neck as thunder rolled across the roof. Alexander took one slow step forward. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough to make everyone listen. "Give me my son." Naomi's lips parted, but no sound came out at first. She had been warned about this man. Everyone in Chicago knew what Alexander Moretti's name meant, though no one in his house said it plainly. Power. Fear. Rules that were never repeated because they never needed to be. And she had broken the one rule that mattered most. She stood barefoot on his staircase, holding his crying baby in the middle of a storm, with the entire household watching her as if she had already made the worst mistake of her life. Still, she did not hand Ethan over. Not yet. Her voice shook, but her eyes stayed on Alexander's. "Sir," she whispered, "please don't take him too fast. He can't catch his breath when he panics." The room went silent in a way thunder could not touch. Alexander stopped mid-step. No servant had ever told him no inside his own home. No one had ever stood between him and his child. And Naomi Brooks, the woman he had barely noticed for 3 weeks, held his son closer beneath the trembling chandelier, as if fear itself had become less important than the baby's next breath. For 3 long seconds, the Moretti mansion became nothing but breath, rain, and the soft, uneven crying of a child. Naomi Brooks stood on the staircase with Ethan pressed against her shoulder, feeling his tiny ribs flutter beneath the blanket as if the storm had gotten inside him. She knew how it looked. A maid in a damp uniform. A baby taken from the protected floor. A rule broken in front of the man who owned every inch of the house, from the iron gates to the silver-framed portraits watching from the walls. Mrs. Whittaker gripped the banister above them, her face tight with the kind of fear that came from knowing exactly how unforgiving Alexander Moretti could be when his orders were ignored. Luca remained near the front door, silent and alert, rain glistening on his dark suit, but even he did not speak. No one did. Alexander's eyes never left Naomi's arms. Ethan gave another broken sob, smaller this time, then turned his wet little face toward Naomi's neck, seeking the warmth he had found there. The sight did something to Alexander that he did not allow anyone to see. It struck too close to the place he kept buried. The place where his wife's laughter used to live. The place that had gone quiet after the accident, after the funeral, after the nursery became less of a room and more of a shrine guarded by schedules, instructions, and fear. His jaw tightened. Control had saved him in boardrooms, in negotiations, in family meetings where one wrong word could cost a man everything he had built. Control had made him respected. Control had kept his household obedient. But control had never stopped Ethan from crying when thunder rolled over Lake Michigan. "I said," Alexander murmured, each word low and measured, "give me my son." Naomi swallowed. Her throat felt dry, even with rain still cooling the side of her face. She looked down at Ethan, then back at his father. "I will, sir. I promise I will. But please lower your voice first." Mrs. Whittaker made a small sound, almost a gasp. Alexander's eyes sharpened. The chandelier flickered overhead, turning his face for one heartbeat into marble and shadow. Naomi felt every servant on that staircase silently begging her to stop speaking, to apologize, to obey, to save herself before pride or mercy cost her the job she needed. But Ethan's breathing hitched again, and that fragile little sound pulled the truth out of her before fear could lock it away. The thunder scared him. Then the room got cold. He was crying so hard he could not settle. "If you take him while your voice is angry, he will think the danger followed him down here." The words landed harder than she intended. Alexander stared at her as if she had touched a wound he had hidden under tailored suits and perfect silence. He looked at Ethan again, at the small fist twisted in Naomi's collar, at the baby's cheek resting against her shoulder with desperate trust. Something in the foyer softened, not enough to be called mercy, but enough for everyone to feel the shift. Alexander removed his wet gloves slowly, one finger at a time, and handed them to Luca without looking away from his son. When he spoke again, his voice was still cold, but it had lost its edge. "What happened upstairs?" Naomi drew a careful breath. The question was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was not punishment either. It was a door opened by 1 inch in a house where doors were usually locked. "The monitor cut out," she said. "I heard him from the hallway below. I waited because I knew the rule. I tried to wait." Her voice trembled on the last word, and she hated that it did. But then he started coughing between cries, and nobody came. Mrs. Whittaker's face changed. Alexander noticed. Naomi noticed too. The room seemed to tilt around that silence. Rain tapped against the tall windows like impatient fingers. Ethan whimpered again, and Naomi began to sway without thinking, one slow step. Then another, the rhythm natural and quiet. Alexander watched the movement with the attention of a man seeing evidence appear in front of him piece by piece. "Nobody came," he repeated. Naomi lifted her chin, not in defiance, but in dignity. "No, sir." "So I did." Alexander Moretti heard those 3 words as if they had been spoken in a courtroom instead of his foyer. "So I did." Not an apology. Not an excuse. A simple confession, carried by a woman whose hands were shaking but whose arms never loosened around his child. For most of his life, people had given Alexander polished answers, careful answers, frightened answers shaped to survive his displeasure. Naomi Brooks gave him the truth with a baby against her chest and rainwater cooling at her temples. That made it harder to dismiss her. Ethan's cries had faded into small, broken hiccups, but his body was still tense beneath the white blanket. Every time thunder rolled across the roof, his tiny fingers tightened in Naomi's collar, and every time Naomi hummed under her breath, he settled by a fraction. Alexander noticed everything. The rhythm of her sway. The way she kept one hand flat against Ethan's back, steady and warm. The way she angled his face away from the bright chandelier. These were not the movements of someone careless. These were the movements of someone who had learned how to comfort fear without making it feel ashamed. Mrs. Whittaker came down 2 steps, her black dress stiff, her silver hair pinned so tightly it seemed painful. "Mr. Moretti, I am certain there is a misunderstanding. Miss Brooks should never have been on the 3rd floor." Naomi lowered her eyes for half a second, then raised them again. "That is true." The admission surprised everyone. She did not defend herself by pretending the rule had not existed. She did not accuse. She did not beg. She stood there and let the weight of what she had done remain in the open. Alexander turned his head slightly toward Mrs. Whittaker. "Where was the night nurse?" Mrs. Whittaker's lips pressed together. "In the east sitting room, sir. The storm interfered with the monitor. We were addressing it." "The baby was crying," Alexander said. "Not fussing. Crying." His voice stayed even, but the temperature in the foyer seemed to drop. Mrs. Whittaker looked toward Naomi, and for one brief moment resentment passed across her face, sharp and ugly, before it vanished behind professionalism. Naomi saw it. Alexander saw that too. Ethan whimpered again, and Alexander stepped closer, slowly this time, as if approaching something fragile rather than something he owned. "Ethan," he said, softer than before. The baby turned his face just enough to hear him, but when Alexander reached out, Ethan's mouth opened in panic and a thin cry broke loose. Alexander froze. His hand remained suspended in the air between father and son. It was such a small thing, that pause, but it changed the room. The most powerful man in the house had been stopped by the fear of an 8-month-old child. Naomi did not move away. She did not look triumphant. She only adjusted the blanket and whispered, "Easy, baby. You are safe. Your daddy is right here." The word daddy struck Alexander harder than any accusation could have. He had heard staff call him sir, boss, Mr. Moretti, but never that. Not in that tone. Not as if he were something a child could reach for instead of something the world stepped around. His fingers slowly lowered. He looked at Naomi, and for the first time that night, he did not see a maid who had broken a rule. He saw a woman holding together the part of his life he had been too afraid to touch gently. "Tell me everything," he said. Naomi glanced upstairs, toward the dark 3rd-floor hallway where the nursery door stood open somewhere beyond the shadows. Her voice dropped to a whisper, not because she feared Alexander anymore, but because the truth itself felt delicate. "It started about 40 minutes before you came home." 40 minutes earlier, Naomi Brooks had been alone in the West Library, polishing the long walnut table while the storm pressed its full weight against the mansion. The room smelled of leather, lemon oil, and old money, the kind of quiet wealth that made every footstep feel like an intrusion. Outside, rain streaked down the tall windows in silver lines, blurring the private lawn and the black iron fence beyond. Every few minutes, lightning flashed over Lake Michigan, turning the shelves of books white for one breath before darkness settled back into the corners. Naomi had been working late because Mrs. Whittaker said the library needed to be perfect before Mr. Moretti returned. Perfect meant no fingerprints on the glass cabinet doors, no dust on the framed photographs, no water rings on the desk where he signed papers that changed other people's lives. Naomi did not complain. She needed the work. She needed the weekly paycheck that kept her small apartment on the south side warm and her younger brother's community college bill from falling behind. So she moved quietly, the way she had taught herself to move in houses where people had more rooms than kindness. Then the baby monitor on the side table crackled. Naomi stopped with the cloth still in her hand. The small white device had been left there by one of the night staff during the evening rush, its green light blinking beside a crystal bowl no one ever used. At first there was only static, soft and uneven, like wind trapped in a wire. Then came Ethan's cry. Not loud at first. Not the sharp cry of hunger or the irritated cry of a tired baby. This one came thin and frightened, rising through the static with a breathless edge that made Naomi's hand tighten around the cloth. She turned toward the door, expecting footsteps in the hallway. None came. The monitor crackled again, then gave a short electronic pop. The green light blinked twice and went dark. Naomi stared at it. Thunder shook the windows so hard the chandelier above the reading area chimed like nervous glass. She waited because she knew the rules. Everyone knew them. The third floor belonged to the baby and to grief. The nursery was not part of her cleaning route. She had been told on her first day that Mr. Moretti allowed no unnecessary staff near his son, no curious eyes, no soft-hearted mistakes. Mrs. Whittaker had said it while looking directly at Naomi, as if kindness itself could become misconduct in a house like this. So Naomi stayed where she was. She folded the cloth once, then unfolded it. She listened. Another cry came from upstairs, muffled by walls and storm, but unmistakable now. Longer. Rougher. A sound that seemed to search the empty rooms for someone who would answer. Naomi stepped into the hallway. The marble under her shoes felt cold. Downstairs, the house was busy with distant storm preparations, doors being checked, generators being discussed, servants moving quickly but not toward the third floor. She looked up the staircase. Darkness pooled near the upper landing. The power had not failed everywhere, but part of the house had gone dim, and the nursery wing sat in shadow. Ethan cried again, and this time the sound broke halfway through, ending in a small cough that pulled Naomi forward before she could think. She climbed one step, then stopped. Her own heartbeat sounded too loud. If Mrs. Whittaker found her, she could be dismissed before morning. If Mr. Moretti found out, the consequences would be worse than losing a job. But another cry came, weaker than the last, and all the fear inside Naomi shifted shape. It was still there, but it was no longer stronger than the truth. A baby was alone in the dark. A baby was scared. And in that moment, the rule felt smaller than the sound of him trying to breathe. Naomi climbed the staircase slowly at first, as if the house itself might hear her disobeying. Each step seemed too loud beneath her shoes, each breath too visible in the dim corridor. The third floor had always felt different from the rest of the mansion. Downstairs, wealth announced itself in polished wood, silver trays, and paintings under warm lights. Up here, everything was softer and sadder. Thick carpet swallowed her footsteps. Family photographs lined the hall in careful frames. A young woman with gentle eyes appeared in many of them, smiling beside Alexander Moretti before the smile disappeared from the newer pictures altogether. Naomi had dusted those frames once under Mrs. Whittaker's watch and had understood without being told that this floor held more than a nursery. It held the part of the house no one was allowed to touch. Ethan cried again from behind the white door at the end of the hall. The sound cut through Naomi's hesitation. She reached the nursery and stood there with her hand hovering over the brass knob. Every warning returned to her at once. Do not enter unless summoned. Do not pick up the child. Do not question the schedule. Do not confuse employment with belonging. Mrs. Whittaker had said those words on Naomi's first morning while handing her a stack of folded linens and a look that made the message even clearer. This was not a home where a maid made choices. This was a home where orders traveled down and silence traveled back up. Naomi closed her eyes. For 1 second, she imagined turning around, walking back to the library, pretending she had heard nothing. It would be safer. It would be smarter. It would keep her name off Mrs. Whittaker's list and her paycheck safe for 1 more week. Then Ethan made a sound so small it nearly broke her. Not a scream. Not even a full cry. A breath caught in fear. Naomi opened the door. The nursery was almost dark. Only the emergency nightlight glowed near the rocking chair, casting a weak amber circle across the rug. Rain tapped somewhere it should not have been tapping. Cold air moved through the room in uneven bursts, lifting the edge of the curtain and carrying the sharp smell of wet fabric. Ethan lay in his crib, twisted partly out of his blanket, his little face red from crying, his eyes squeezed shut against the thunder. His tiny hands opened and closed as if reaching for someone who had not come. Naomi stepped inside and immediately understood that this was not ordinary fussing. The room was too cold. The shadows were wrong. The baby's blanket was damp at one corner where the wind had carried rain across the floor. She crossed to the crib, but she did not lift him right away. First, she lowered her voice. Hey, sweet boy. I hear you. I am right here. Ethan startled at the sound, then coughed between sobs. Naomi's training, the kind no rich household had ever bothered to ask about, came back to her in pieces. Lower the stimulation, warm the body, slow the rhythm, never rush a frightened child from panic into more panic. She pulled the dry side of the blanket around him, then looked toward the window. One latch had slipped loose. The frame trembled against the storm, allowing rain and cold air to spill into the nursery inch by inch. Naomi moved quickly, closing the latch with both hands until it caught. The sudden quiet after the window sealed felt almost sacred. But Ethan was still shaking, his breath still uneven. Naomi looked at the closed door behind her, then back at the crib. That was the moment the rule truly broke. Not when she opened the nursery. Not when she stepped across the carpet. It broke when she reached down and lifted Alexander Moretti's crying son into her arms because leaving him there would have been easier, but it would not have been right. The moment Ethan settled against Naomi's chest, she felt how cold he was through the thin cotton of his sleep clothes. Not dangerously cold, not enough to alarm someone who only glanced from the doorway, but enough for a woman who had held frightened children through long hospital nights to know that comfort had been slipping away from him minute by minute. His small body shivered once, then again, each tremor hidden beneath the blanket until she gathered him close and felt the truth for herself. The nursery looked beautiful in the weak amber light, all ivory furniture, painted clouds, silver picture frames, and shelves of expensive stuffed animals arranged with museum-like care. But beauty had not protected him. The wet curtain clung to the wall. A dark patch had spread across the rug beneath the window. The crib had been placed only a few feet from the draft, close enough that every burst of wind had carried cold mist toward the mattress. Naomi looked at the baby monitor on the nightstand. Dead. She looked at the small digital thermometer near the changing table. The screen blinked, then faded, then blinked again as if the storm had confused the room itself. Ethan's cries rose sharply when another roll of thunder crossed the lake, and his breath came fast against her collarbone. Naomi moved without thinking now, not as an employee trying to survive a mistake, but as a caregiver answering a need. She carried him to the changing table, keeping one hand firm and steady along his back. I know, she whispered. That was loud. But it passed. You are still here. I am still here. The words were simple, almost too soft for the room, but they gave her rhythm. She found a dry blanket folded in the lower drawer, warmed it between her palms, and wrapped it around him from shoulder to feet. She checked his socks, found one damp at the edge, and replaced both with a clean pair from a basket embroidered with his initials. The whole time, Ethan kept crying, but the sound began to change. It lost the panicked sharpness and became tired, wounded, pleading. Naomi had heard that change before in pediatric waiting rooms, in church nurseries, in the apartment hallway where her neighbor's baby cried through teething nights while parents worked double shifts. It was the sound of a child who did not understand why the world had become so loud and why no familiar arms had arrived. On the dresser sat a small silver-framed photograph of Alexander's late wife holding Ethan as a newborn. Beside it rested an old wooden music box, its lid slightly open. Naomi had seen it before while dusting under supervision. Mrs. Whitaker had told her not to touch it. Tonight, Naomi touched nothing she did not need, but she leaned close enough to recognize the faint melody painted on the underside of the lid, the same tune she had heard from the box during her first week when a nurse wound it for the baby. Naomi did not know the words, if it even had words, but she remembered the notes. She began to hum them under her breath, low and slow, matching the sway of her body to the melody. Ethan's fist caught the fabric near her shoulder. His crying broke, then softened. The thunder still rolled, the rain still struck the glass, and the rich, perfect nursery still felt colder than any room made for a child should feel. Naomi looked toward the hallway, knowing the third floor would be the first place they searched if anyone noticed she was missing. Then the lights flickered hard, and the emergency lamp dimmed to a dull orange glow. Ethan startled again, his face crumpling against her. Naomi made the choice before fear could argue. The nursery was not safe enough, not warm enough, not calm enough. She gathered the dry blanket tighter, stepped over the wet patch on the rug, and carried Alexander Moretti's son out of the room. Naomi stepped into the third-floor hallway with Ethan tucked securely against her, and the difference was immediate. The air beyond the nursery felt warmer, still touched by the storm but no longer carrying that wet chill from the loose window. She did not hurry. Hurrying made frightened babies feel chased by the thing they feared. Instead, she moved with careful, measured steps, one hand supporting Ethan's head, the other spread across his back where she could feel his breath fluttering in uneven little waves. In through the nose, she whispered, though he was too young to understand the words. Out slow. That is it, sweet boy. Borrow my breathing until you find yours. She drew each breath deliberately, letting her chest rise and fall against him, giving his tiny body a rhythm to follow. The crying did not stop all at once. It loosened, inch by inch, like a knot being untied by patient fingers. When thunder cracked again, Naomi turned his face gently away from the windows and lowered her hum until it became more vibration than song. She had learned that trick years ago during overnight shifts at St. Agnes Children's Hospital, where she had not been a nurse, not officially, just an aide with tired feet and a name tag most doctors forgot to read. But children had remembered her. They remembered the woman who dimmed lights before monitors beeped too loudly, who warmed blankets in the dryer, who spoke softly during storms, who knew that fear did not always need medicine first. Sometimes it needed a steady voice, a dry blanket, and someone willing to stay. Ethan's cheek pressed against her shoulder. His fist opened, then closed again, catching the fabric of her uniform. Naomi paused near a narrow side table where a small stuffed bear sat beneath a framed photograph. She recognized it from the nursery shelf, a worn brown bear that looked older than all the other perfect toys, its ears slightly bent, its ribbon faded. The expensive animals in Ethan's room had no scent, no memory, no softness earned by use. This bear did. Naomi picked it up carefully and tucked it between Ethan and the blanket. The baby's crying broke into a shuddering sigh. His mouth trembled, but he turned toward the bear as if recognizing something safe. Naomi's eyes stung. "There you are," she whispered. "There is my brave boy." A soft click sounded somewhere below, followed by voices rising from the service corridor. Someone had noticed. Naomi looked down the long staircase and saw the faint glow of flashlights moving in the lower hall. She knew what they would see first, not the wet rug, not the broken latch, not the dead monitor, not the baby finally breathing easier. They would see her. A maid where she should not be, holding what she had no permission to hold. For one moment, fear returned so strongly that her knees nearly weakened. Her brother's tuition. Her overdue electric bill. The rent notice folded in her purse. Every reason she could not afford to lose this job stood in front of her like a wall. Then Ethan gave a tiny hiccup and nestled closer, warm now beneath the dry blanket. Naomi looked at his face, at the lashes wet from crying, at the small hand resting against the bear, and the wall inside her fell. Whatever happened next, he had stopped trembling. Whatever Alexander Moretti believed when he came home, his son would not be alone in the dark again. Naomi descended the staircase slowly, carrying the baby toward the warmer lights below, not knowing that the front door was about to open, and the man she feared most was about to see only the final moment of a story he had not yet understood. Alexander Moretti had seen only the last 30 seconds, and 30 seconds were enough to make a careful man believe the wrong story. The security tablet in Luca's hand had flickered awake the moment the front gate opened, showing a grainy hallway feed from the third floor. No sound. No storm through the lens. No crying sharp enough to bend a woman's conscience. Just Naomi Brooks stepping out of the nursery with Ethan in her arms, the white blanket gathered around him, her face turned away from the camera as if she were hiding something. Alexander had watched the clip once in the back seat while rain hammered the roof of the car. Then again as they crossed the driveway. By the third replay, his expression had gone completely still. He did not see the loose window latch. He did not see the wet rug or the dead monitor or the way Ethan had been shaking before Naomi lifted him. The camera had captured the part of the truth that looked like guilt and left out the part that would have looked like mercy. That was why, when he stepped into the foyer and found her halfway down the staircase, his mind had already built a case against her. His son. His rule. His house. Her arms around what he loved most. Now, standing only a few feet away from Naomi, Alexander felt the old fear twisting beneath his control. It was not the fear men expected from him. It was not fear of losing money, power, territory, or reputation. Those things could be managed. Rebuilt. Protected. This fear wore a blue sleep shirt, clutched a faded brown bear, and made small wounded sounds against the shoulder of a woman Alexander barely knew. Ethan whimpered as another flash of lightning filled the windows. Naomi turned her body slightly, shielding his eyes from the brightness, and the movement was so practiced, so gentle, that it unsettled Alexander more than defiance would have. A thief would have run. A liar would have babbled. Naomi only stood there, trembling but steady, holding the baby in the exact way his doctors had instructed the staff to hold him during distress, with his head supported, his chest free, his back warmed by an open palm. Alexander's gaze moved to the bear tucked against Ethan's blanket. It had belonged to Isabella, his late wife, long before Ethan was born. No one used it anymore. It sat near her photograph because Alexander could not bear to put it away and could not bear to let it become ordinary. Yet Ethan held it now with one tiny hand, his breath slowly calming against Naomi's neck. "Where did you get that?" Alexander asked. The question came out colder than he intended. Naomi looked down at the bear, then back at him. "From the side table in the hallway, sir. He reached toward it when I passed. I thought it might help." Mrs. Whitaker descended another step. "That item is not for staff to touch." Naomi flinched, not from guilt, but from the cruelty hidden inside the word staff. Alexander heard it too. For the first time, he noticed the way Mrs. Whittaker looked at Naomi, as if compassion were a stain on the uniform. Luca shifted near the door, silent, watching his employer more than the maid. The whole house seemed to wait for Alexander to decide what kind of man he would be in the next 10 seconds. He reached for Ethan again, slower now, his palm open. "Come here, little man," he murmured. For one fragile moment, the baby looked at him. Then thunder cracked over the lake, and Ethan cried out, twisting away from the sound and back toward Naomi. Alexander's hand stopped in the air. The rejection was tiny, innocent, and devastating. Naomi did not smile. She did not claim victory. She whispered into the baby's hair, "Your daddy is here. He is not the storm." Alexander's face changed. Not much. Just enough for the room to feel it. The words had entered the place no one in the mansion ever dared to name. For months, he had protected Ethan with locked doors, strict schedules, and people paid to obey him. But his son had not needed more fear around him. He had needed someone willing to hear him before he broke. Alexander lowered his hand. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer a command. It was almost a question. "Show me the nursery." Naomi turned toward the staircase with Ethan still against her shoulder, and for the first time since she had opened the nursery door, she felt the weight of every eye move with her. Alexander followed one step behind, close enough that she could feel the authority of him without looking back. Luca came after them, silent as a shadow. Mrs. Whittaker walked last, her heels tapping against the marble with a nervous rhythm she tried and failed to control. No one spoke as they climbed. The storm filled the spaces where words should have been, rolling over the roof, pushing rain against the windows, making the old house groan in places Naomi had not known houses could groan. Ethan had quieted to small hiccups now, his face tucked into the warm hollow between Naomi's shoulder and the faded bear. Each time his breathing settled, Alexander saw it. Each time Naomi adjusted her hand with gentle patience, he saw that too. At the third-floor landing, the air changed. It was subtle at first, a thin current of cold moving beneath the door at the end of the hall. Alexander stopped before anyone else did. He looked at the nursery, then at Mrs. Whittaker. "Why is that door open?" Mrs. Whittaker straightened. "I believe Miss Brooks left in a hurry, sir." Naomi said nothing. She only held Ethan closer as he stirred at the sound of that blame slipping into the hallway. Alexander walked past them and pushed the nursery door fully open. The weak amber light revealed the room exactly as Naomi had left it, beautiful from a distance and wrong up close. The curtain near the window hung damp and heavy. Water darkened the rug in an uneven patch. One corner of the crib sheet had been changed, but the mattress beneath still showed a faint line of moisture where the cold mist had reached it. The baby monitor sat dead on the nightstand, its screen black, its cord loose behind the table as if it had been pulled just enough to fail and not enough to be noticed. For several seconds, Alexander did not move. His eyes traveled from the window latch to the wet rug, from the crib to the blanket Naomi had abandoned on the chair because it was too damp to use. The truth did not arrive gently. It entered the room and stood there in plain sight. Naomi had not carried his son out because she wanted to touch what was forbidden. She had carried him out because the room built to protect him had failed him. Alexander reached for the window latch. It shifted under his fingers, not broken entirely, but loose enough that a hard gust could push it open again. His hand stilled. Behind him, Mrs. Whittaker drew a breath. "That latch was reported last week," Luca said quietly. The words landed like a key turning in a lock. Alexander turned his head slowly. "Reported to whom?" Mrs. Whittaker's face lost its color. "Maintenance was scheduled, sir. With the rain and the charity dinner preparations, it was not considered urgent." Ethan whimpered at the tension in her voice. Naomi began humming again without thinking, the same low melody from the music box, and the baby settled before anyone else could help him. Alexander looked from His son to the woman holding him, then back to the room that had been managed by rules and neglected by attention. His voice dropped, quiet and colder than the draft from the window. My son was sleeping beside a broken latch in a storm, and no one considered it urgent. No one answered. The nursery, with its ivory furniture and silver frames, suddenly felt less like a room for a child and more like evidence of everything money could buy except care. Alexander stepped toward Naomi, and this time when he reached for Ethan, he did not command. He waited. Naomi searched his face, found something there that had not been there before, and slowly eased the baby toward him. Ethan lasted only one heartbeat in his father's arms before his mouth trembled and his little hand reached back toward Naomi. Alexander felt it, the tiny pull away from him, and pain moved across his face so quickly most people would have missed it. Naomi did not. She took one small step closer and whispered, "Hold him higher against your chest. Let him hear your heart before he hears the storm." Alexander obeyed her. The room went silent. Alexander stood in the middle of the nursery with his son pressed high against his chest, one broad hand supporting Ethan's back exactly where Naomi had shown him. At first, nothing changed. The baby's breath still fluttered. His small face still tightened each time the storm pushed against the glass. Alexander looked almost uncertain, and uncertainty did not belong naturally on a man who had built his entire life around never showing it. He glanced toward Naomi, not as a boss looking at staff, but as a father silently asking for help without knowing how to form the words. Naomi softened her voice. "Do not bounce him too fast. Just breathe slow. Let him borrow your calm." Alexander drew in a careful breath. It seemed awkward at first, like he was learning a language he should have known from birth. His shoulders lowered by an inch. His jaw unclenched. The room listened. Ethan's cheek rested against his father's shirt, and for one fragile moment, the little boy stopped fighting the sound of the rain. Naomi saw Alexander feel it. Not with pride. Not with relief. With shock. The kind that comes when a man realizes a locked door has been open all along, and he had simply been too afraid to touch the handle. Mrs. Whittaker stood near the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her uniform, watching the scene with a face that tried to remain professional and failed. Luca stayed beside the window, examining the latch but saying nothing more. The storm had exposed enough. Alexander looked down at Ethan, then toward the damp crib, the dead monitor, the wet curtain, the room filled with expensive things that had not answered his child. "Why did he stop with you?" he asked, and the question was quieter than any command he had given that night. Naomi folded her hands in front of her, suddenly aware of the damp hem of her sleeves, the plainness of her uniform, the fact that she was standing in a room where she had been told she did not belong. "Because I listened before I touched him," she said. Alexander looked up. Naomi swallowed, but she did not take the words back. "He was not crying for attention, sir. He was crying because no one heard him." The sentence fell into the nursery and did not move. Even the rain seemed to soften against the windows. Alexander's eyes changed first, then his face, as if something behind it had finally cracked enough for grief to breathe. For months, people had told him Ethan was sensitive, difficult, spoiled by loss, confused by routine changes, frightened by storms. They had given him reports, suggestions, invoices, schedules. But no one had said it that plainly. No one had dared to suggest that his son's pain had not been a problem to manage, but a voice asking to be answered. Alexander looked at Ethan again. The baby's hand rested against his shirt now, no longer reaching away, but not fully relaxed either. Trust, Naomi knew, did not arrive because someone powerful demanded it. Trust came slowly. It came through warmth, repetition, patience, and the courage to be gentle in a room built on fear. Alexander seemed to understand that without being told. His thumb moved lightly over the blanket, hesitant but careful. Ethan gave a small sigh, the kind that loosened the whole body. Naomi felt Tears gathered behind her eyes, but she kept them there. This was not her family. This was not her place. That was what the house had taught her. But the baby had not known the rules, and his need had pulled the truth into the open. Alexander raised his eyes to hers. "You said nobody came." Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." His voice dropped. "And you came anyway." She held his gaze, frightened and steady at the same time. "Yes, sir." Another silence opened between them, wider and warmer than the ones before. Then Ethan, still tucked against his father's chest, made a soft sound that was not quite a word, barely more than a breath. Alexander froze. Naomi heard it too. It sounded like the beginning of Papa. The entire room stood still as if the storm itself had stopped to listen. The sound was so small that anyone careless might have missed it, but no one in that nursery was careless anymore. Alexander Moretti stood with Ethan against his chest, his face stripped of every mask the mansion had ever known. For months, he had heard reports about his son. He had heard that Ethan slept poorly, cried during storms, turned away from unfamiliar voices, refused certain bottles, rejected certain blankets, and woke from naps reaching for someone who was no longer there. But he had not heard that sound. Not since the last morning Isabella had been alive, when she had lifted their baby from the crib, kissed his forehead, and laughed through her tears because he had made a soft little noise that sounded almost like Papa. Alexander had carried that memory like a photograph folded too many times in a wallet, precious and damaged, opened only when no one could see. Now it had returned in the middle of rain, in a nursery with a broken latch, in front of a maid who had risked everything because she refused to let a child cry alone. His hand trembled once against Ethan's back. Naomi saw it and looked away, not because she was ashamed of noticing, but because some moments deserved privacy even when they happened in a room full of people. Alexander lowered his head until his cheek nearly touched Ethan's hair. "I am here," he whispered, and the words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, not because he had never said them, but because he had never said them without armor. Ethan sighed again. The brown bear slipped slightly from the blanket, and Naomi reached forward by instinct to catch it before it fell. She stopped halfway, remembering herself, remembering the rules, remembering the woman in the photograph and the man holding what remained of her. Alexander noticed the hesitation. "It is all right," he said quietly. Naomi adjusted the bear near Ethan's hand, and as she did, the lid of the wooden music box on the dresser shifted with the vibration of thunder. A few faint notes rose into the room, thin and uneven, but unmistakable. Naomi looked at it. Alexander did too. His expression changed so sharply that Mrs. Whittaker took a step back. "That song," he said. Naomi's voice came carefully. "I heard it my first week, sir. One of the nurses wound the box before his nap. He settled when it played, so tonight I hummed what I remembered." Alexander stared at the music box as if it had spoken from another life. "Isabella sang that to him," he said. The name entered the room like candlelight entering a church. No one moved. Even Luca lowered his eyes. Naomi felt the full weight of what she had unknowingly touched, not an object, not a tune, but a bridge between a grieving father and a child too young to understand loss except as absence. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I did not know." Alexander looked back at her, and the coldness that had once made him seem untouchable was gone. In its place was something raw, exhausted, and human. "No," he said. "You remembered what everyone else treated like decoration." Mrs. Whittaker's face tightened, but she said nothing. The truth had shifted too far to be pushed back into silence. Alexander turned toward the crib, toward the damp sheet, the dead monitor, the window that should have been repaired before the storm ever came. For the first time, the room did not look like a protected space to him. It looked like a place where grief had been preserved so carefully that care itself had been forgotten. Ethan stirred, and Alexander held him a little closer, not with fear now, but with learning. Naomi stood near the Doorway, hands folded, expecting to be dismissed from a moment that belonged to family. Instead, Alexander looked at her and said, "Stay." One word. Not an order this time. Something quieter. Something that sounded almost like trust. "Stay." The word settled over Naomi with a weight she did not know how to carry. She had expected to be ordered out, written up, dismissed before sunrise, maybe sent back into the rain with her last paycheck folded inside an envelope. Instead, Alexander Moretti stood in the damaged nursery with his son against his chest and asked her to remain as if her presence had become part of what kept the room from breaking apart. Naomi nodded once, unable to trust her voice. Mrs. Whitaker's mouth tightened. "Mr. Moretti, with respect, staff boundaries exist for a reason." Alexander turned his head toward her, and the softness he had shown Ethan did not follow his gaze. "So does accountability." The room went still. Luca stepped away from the window and held up the loosened latch between two fingers. "Maintenance log shows this was reported 8 days ago," he said quietly. Follow-up was marked completed. Alexander did not raise his voice. He did not need to. By whom? Mrs. Whitaker looked at the wet rug, then at the crib, then at Naomi as if searching for a place to put the blame. The household has been under pressure. The charity dinner required attention. The nurses rotate. The storm was unexpected. Alexander looked toward the window where rain still streaked the glass in silver lines. A storm in Chicago in April is not unexpected. A child sleeping 3 feet from a broken latch is not pressure. It is neglect. The word was not shouted, but it made Mrs. Whitaker flinch. Ethan stirred, and Alexander immediately lowered his voice, adjusting the baby higher against his chest the way Naomi had taught him. That small correction, that choice to protect the child's calm over his own anger, changed something in Naomi's understanding of him. He was still powerful. Still dangerous in the way men became dangerous when everyone around them learned to fear disappointment. But beneath that, he was a father learning too late that fear could not be the foundation of a home. "Effective tonight," Alexander said, "the nursery wing is closed until every window, monitor, outlet, heater, and camera is inspected." Luca nodded. "I will call a licensed emergency contractor." "Not tomorrow. Now." "Yes, sir." Alexander looked back at Mrs. Whitaker. "Every report involving Ethan comes to me directly. No filtering. No delaying. No deciding what matters because a baby cannot defend his own needs." Mrs. Whitaker's face paled further. "And my position? You will hand over every maintenance record, every nurse schedule, and every incident note from the past 6 months. Then you will leave this floor." The silence after that was sharper than punishment. Mrs. Whitaker lowered her eyes and walked out, her footsteps fading down the hall that had once belonged to her authority. Naomi stood frozen near the doorway, still expecting the correction to turn toward her. Alexander looked at her instead. "Miss Brooks." His voice was quieter now. "You broke my rule." Naomi's hands folded tighter. "Yes, sir. And if you had followed it, my son would have stayed in a cold room while everyone waited for permission." She could not answer. The truth sat between them, plain and painful. Alexander looked down at Ethan, who had finally softened fully against him, one hand still curled around the faded bear. "From now on, when Ethan cries, you do not wait for permission." Naomi's eyes lifted. "Sir?" "You go to him." Rain moved against the windows. The music box gave one faint note, almost like agreement. And for the first time since Naomi had entered the Moretti mansion, the rule that mattered most was not silence. It was care. Morning came gently, as if the storm had spent all its anger in the night and left the Moretti mansion washed, quiet, and unfamiliar with peace. Pale sunlight moved across the marble floors where rainwater had dried in faint traces near the front door. Outside, Broken branches lay across the private drive, and workers in bright safety vests inspected the estate windows one by one. Inside, the third-floor nursery no longer felt untouchable. It smelled of fresh linens, warm air, and lemon soap. The damp rug had been removed before dawn. The crib had been moved away from the window. A new monitor blinked steadily on the dresser, its soft green light small but reassuring. Naomi Brooks stood near the hallway with her coat folded over one arm and an envelope held carefully in both hands. She had slept less than 1 hour in the staff room, not because anyone ordered her to stay awake, but because her mind would not stop returning to the staircase, the nursery, the way Alexander had looked when Ethan made that almost word against his chest. By sunrise, she had made the only decision that felt responsible. Kindness had saved her through the night, but rules still had consequences in houses like this. She had written her resignation on plain white paper from the kitchen drawer, each sentence neat, respectful, and painful. She thanked the household for the opportunity. She apologized for crossing boundaries. She explained that she never meant disrespect. She did not mention the broken latch. She did not mention Mrs. Whitaker. She did not mention the way Ethan had clung to her like a child who knew the difference between duty and care. At 7:15, Alexander stepped out of the nursery carrying his son. He wore no suit jacket, only a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, the collar open, his face tired in the honest way of a man who had finally stopped pretending grief was discipline. Ethan rested against him, awake but calm, one small hand wrapped around the faded brown bear. When the baby saw Naomi, his eyes brightened, and his fingers opened in her direction. Naomi's heart pulled before her feet could move. She stayed where she was. Alexander noticed the envelope first. "What is that?" Naomi held it out. "My resignation, sir." The word sounded steadier than she felt. "I appreciate what you said last night, but I crossed a line in your home. I do not want my presence to create more trouble for your family." Alexander took the envelope, looked at it, and then placed it unopened on the hallway table. "Last night, you did not create trouble." His voice was low, rough with exhaustion and something deeper. "You revealed it." Naomi blinked. The morning light caught the edge of tears she had been fighting since the storm began. Alexander looked down at Ethan, then back at her. "You were hired to clean this house. Somehow, you were the only one who saw what needed care." The words settled over her slowly. Not flattery. Not pity. Recognition. The kind Naomi had learned not to expect from people who looked past uniforms and decided they had seen the whole person. Ethan reached for her again, this time with a soft, impatient sound. Alexander almost smiled, but it faded into something more humble. "He trusts you," he said. "And I am learning why." Naomi stepped closer, carefully, letting Ethan choose. The baby touched her sleeve and relaxed. In that quiet hallway, beneath photographs that no longer felt like warnings, Alexander Moretti understood that a home protected by fear could still fail a child, but a woman with nothing to gain had brought warmth into the coldest room in his mansion. Naomi did not become visible because power finally looked at her. She had always been visible. Power had simply been too blind to see. And that morning, the house did not remember the rule she broke. It remembered the child she held, the storm she answered, and the dignity she never put down.